The rain hammered the tin roof like accusations, each drop a reminder of the storm Eleanor had unleashed years ago. You'll never be a real woman, Genesis. Not with that fire in your eyes that burns for the wrong kind of love. Those words had clawed into her soul that sweltering August night in Monroe, Georgia, when her mother had caught her stealing a kiss under the willow tree with a girl from the wrong side of the tracks. Now, 16 years later, Genesis stood in the dim glow of her family's distillery office, the scent of aged bourbon thick in the air, and signed the papers that would finally silence that echo forever. She traced the ink with her fingertip, the contract blurring slightly as memory flooded back, the way Eleanor's voice had cracked not with sorrow, but with the cold precision of a judge passing sentence. Genesis had been 18 then, fresh out of high school, her world still wrapped in the illusions of peach orchards and Sunday sermons. The distillery Hawthorne Spirits had been her father's dream, a modest empire built on corn whiskey and family recipes passed down through generations of Hawthorne men. But her father was gone, felled by a heart attack 2 years prior, leaving behind a legacy that Eleanor guarded like a fortress. Genesis had always known the business would be hers one day. It was in her blood, the way the copper stills gleamed under the barn lights, the ritual of tasting batches that carried whispers of the earth itself. Yet her mother saw only weakness in her daughter's quiet rebellion, the way Genesis preferred the company of books and starlit fields to the debutante balls and eligible sons of Monroe's old money. That night under the willow, with Lena's lips soft against hers, Lena, the mechanic's daughter with grease-streaked hands and a laugh like summer thunder, Genesis had felt alive for the first time. But Eleanor had emerged from the shadows like a specter, her pearl necklace glinting in the moonlight, and the world had fractured. "This ends now," she'd hissed, dragging Genesis inside by the wrist, the screen door slamming like a gavel. Lena had vanished into the night, and with her went Genesis's fragile sense of self. The weeks that followed were a blur of therapy sessions in Atlanta, Bible studies led by Eleanor's church ladies, and the suffocating expectation that Genesis would straighten her path, marry well, and carry the Hawthorne name into respectability. But the fire Eleanor decried never dimmed. It smoldered, waiting. Genesis threw herself into the distillery, learning the stills from the old hands who'd worked for her father, memorizing the subtle shifts in flavor from barrel to barrel. By 25, she was running operations, her innovations, infusing local honeysuckle into small-batch releases, earning quiet acclaim at regional tastings. Monroe whispered about the Hawthorne heiress, the one who dressed in flannel and boots, who spoke to the workers like equals rather than servants. "She's got her daddy's grit," they'd say in the feed store, but Eleanor heard only threats to tradition. It was during a harvest festival in the fall of her 28th year that Clara arrived, like a gust of wind off the Chattahoochee River. The event was a Hawthorne staple. Tents strung with fairy lights along the distillery grounds, fiddles wailing from a makeshift stage, and tables groaning under fried chicken and pecan pie. Genesis manned the tasting booth, pouring samples into tin cups, her smile polite but distant as locals probed about her single status. "When are you settling down, Jen?" old Mr. Hargrove had asked, his mustache twitching over a tumbler of her latest rye. She'd deflected with a laugh, but inside the old ache stirred. Clara was there as a vendor, her stall a riot of handmade leather goods, wallets etched with river motifs, belts tooled with wildflower patterns, sold from a battered pickup truck she'd driven down from Athens. She was 30, with a no-nonsense bob of chestnut hair and eyes the color of storm clouds, her hands calloused from years apprenticing under a Savannah artisan. Born to tenant farmers who'd lost their land to a mill collapse in the 90s, Clara had clawed her way through community college on scholarships and grit, her work a testament to reclaimed roots. She caught Genesis's eye across the crowded green, not with flirtation, but with the steady way she bartered with a group of wide-eyed kids, trading a keychain for their drawings of the orchard. Their first conversation happened over a spilled jar of Clara's beeswax polish, which tipped into Genesis's boot during a sudden downpour. "Damn it all," Clara muttered, kneeling to dab at the mess with her bandana, her voice carrying the soft drawl of coastal Georgia. Genesis crouched beside her, the mud sucking at their knees, and for a moment the festival faded. The laughter, the clink of glasses, the weight of eyes always watching. "Let me buy you a drink to make up for it," Genesis said, surprising herself with the ease of it. Clara looked up, rain tracing paths down her cheek, and grinned. Only if it's the good stuff. None of that tourists will. They ended up under the eaves of the old barrel house, sharing a flask of Hawthorne's Reserve, the bourbon warming against the chill. Clara talked of her travels, hitchhiking up the eastern seaboard, apprenticing in leather shops from Portland to Charleston, her stories weaving tales of freedom that Genesis had only dreamed of. "I make things that last," Clara said, holding up a bracelet she'd slipped onto her wrist, the leather supple and scarred from use. "Not like the world, which breaks everything it touches." Genesis felt a pull, deep and unspoken, the kind that had once terrified her. But here, in the shadow of her inheritance, with Clara's gaze steady and unjudging, she let herself lean in. By the end of the night, they'd exchanged numbers scribbled on a napkin, and Genesis walked Clara to her truck under a canopy of stars. As the engine coughed to life, Clara rolled down the window and said, "Come find me in Athens sometime. I'll show you how to tool your own story into something unbreakable." Genesis watched the taillights disappear down the gravel road, her heart pounding with a rhythm she'd long suppressed. For the first time since Lena, she wondered if the fire could be more than destruction, if it could forge instead. The weeks blurred into stolen weekends. Genesis drove the hour to Athens in her father's old Ford, the radio tuned to bluegrass stations that echoed her growing unrest. Clara's apartment was a third-floor walk-up above a coffee roastery, walls lined with sketches of rivers and hides stretched on racks, the air scented with tanned leather and fresh ground beans. They spent afternoons in Clara's workshop, Genesis's hands clumsy at first on the awl, but Clara patient, her fingers guiding without demand. "It's about the scars," Clara would say, tracing a gouge in a half-finished belt. "They tell the truth of what you've endured." Their touches started tentative, a brush of knuckles over tools, a shared laugh that lingered too long. One evening, as thunder rumbled outside and the power flickered, they sat cross-legged on the floor, passing a bottle of Genesis's bourbon between them. The storm mirrored the one building inside her, the push-pull of want against the ghosts of Monroe. "Tell me about home," Clara prompted, her voice soft in the dim lamplight. Genesis hesitated, then spilled it all. The willow tree, Eleanor's verdict, the way the distillery both anchored and chained her. Clara listened without interruption, her hand finding Genesis's in the dark, thumb stroking the back of her palm like a promise. When their lips met, it was slow, deliberate tasting of whiskey and rain. Genesis pulled back first, breath ragged, eyes searching Clara's for regret. But there was only heat, mirrored and unyielding. "I've waited my whole life for someone who sees me," Clara whispered, and in that moment Genesis believed she could be seen, fully, fiercely, without the distortions of expectation. Back in Monroe, the idol cracked under the weight of reality. Eleanor had taken to hosting salons in the big house, gatherings of the town's elite where whispers about the distillery's future flowed like sweet tea. "Genesis is brilliant with the recipes," she'd say, her smile sharp as a switchblade. "But leadership requires a certain steadiness." The subtext hung heavy. A woman like Genesis, unmarried and untethered, couldn't helm Hawthorne spirits through the shifting tides of craft liquor markets. Rumors swirled of Eleanor's overtures to investors from Atlanta, men in crisp suits who eyed the property's acreage for subdivision. Genesis buried herself in work, overseeing expansions, a new aging room dug into the hillside, partnerships with local beekeepers for those honeysuckle infusions. But Clara became her refuge, their calls late into the night a lifeline. "When are you bringing me to meet the Stills?" Clara teased one evening, her voice crackling over the line. Genesis laughed, but the question lodged like a thorn. To bring Clara into Monroe was to invite the town's judgment, Eleanor's blade. The breaking point came at Christmas, the Hawthorne tradition of a lavish dinner under crystal chandeliers. Eleanor had invited the Reverend's son, Harlan, a banker from Savannah with a jaw like carved oak and eyes that appraised rather than saw. He sat across from Genesis, droning about merger opportunities over roast quail, his hand occasionally brushing hers in what he clearly intended as courtship. She endured it, fork-scraping porcelain, until Eleanor's gaze pinned her like a butterfly. "Harlan speaks of a future for Hawthorne that aligns with our values," her mother said. The word values laced with venom. That night, alone in her childhood room with its faded wallpaper of climbing roses, Genesis called Clara. I can't breathe here, she confessed, voice muffled against the pillow. Clara's response was immediate. Then come to me. Or better, let's run this by your ghosts together. The idea terrified and thrilled her. A week later, on a gray January morning, Clara arrived in Monroe unannounced, her truck loaded with leather scraps and a bottle of mead from an Athens apiary. They walked the distillery grounds, Clara's boots crunching frost-kissed leaves, her questions probing the heart of the place, the coppa's hum, the barrel's whispered secrets. Eleanor found them in the tasting room, mid-laugh over a flawed batch that tasted of overripe peaches. The air thickened instantly, Eleanor's silhouette filling the doorway like a storm front. Genesis, she said, voice iced. We have company. Her eyes flicked to Clara, cataloging the work-worn jeans, the unpowdered face, the easy familiarity. Harlan wasn't mentioned, but his absence loomed. Dinner that evening was a battlefield. Clara held her own, charming the table with tales of leatherworking marathons and the resilience of kudzu vines, but Eleanor's barbs were subtle scalpels. It's admirable, dear, how some folk make do with so little, she said over pecan pie, her smile benevolent as a noose. Genesis's hand found Clara's under the table, a silent anchor, but the pressure built, coiling in her chest. The fallout simmered through February's chill, Eleanor's silences more damning than shouts. She began excluding Genesis from board meetings, citing delicate negotiations with those Atlanta suits. Her office door a barricade etched with hawthorn crests. Whispers from the workers reached Genesis like smoke, rumors of buyouts, of the land being carved into luxury lots with views of the river. Your mama's got plans, old Silas, the head distiller, confided one afternoon as they racked barrels, his pipe smoke curling like secrets. Says it's for the family's good. Genesis confronted her in the greenhouse, amid the potted figs her father had tended, the air heavy with loamy earth. This is my inheritance, she said, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Eleanor's response was a scalpel's twist. Inheritance demands sacrifice, Genesis. You've always chosen indulgence over duty. The word indulgence landed like a slap, evoking Lena's ghost, the willow's shadow. That night she drove to Athens, collapsing into Clara's arms on the worn sofa, the apartment's warmth a balm against the frost. Clara didn't press for details. Instead, she drew Genesis into her workbench, handing her a half-tooled wallet blank. Etch your anger here, she murmured, guiding the stylus. As the leather yielded under pressure, Genesis poured out the day's barbs, the lines emerging jagged and true. A river forked by rocks, a tree bent but unbroken. Their lovemaking followed, urgent and tender, bodies mapping the terrains they'd each navigated alone. In Clara's arms, Genesis glimpsed a life unbound by Monroe's maps, where love wasn't a scandal but a foundation. Spring unfurled with dogwoods blooming pink against the clay banks, and with it, a fragile normalcy. Clara visited more openly, her truck a fixture at the distillery gate, where workers nodded hellos instead of stares. They collaborated on a limited release, bottles wrapped in Clara's leather cuffs, etched with motifs of Georgia wildflowers, marketed as roots reclaimed. Tastings in nearby Macon drew crowds, the bourbon's notes of vanilla and smoke earning praise, sales spiking enough to fund a second still. For stolen hours, Genesis felt the fire as ally not curse, Clara's hand in hers during quiet drives along backroads, windows down to the scent of pine and possibility. But Eleanor's campaign gathered steam like a summer squall. She hosted a gala at the big house, ostensibly for charity but laced with agenda. Invitations heavy with Atlanta's venture capitalists, menus scripted to impress. Genesis arrived on Clara's arm, a deliberate defiance, her simple sheath dress a contrast to the sequins and bow ties. Heads turned as they entered the foyer, chandeliers casting prisms on polished floors, the air humming with string quartets and veiled judgments. Who's the artisan? A dowager murmured behind her fan, the word artisan a polite veil for outsider. Harlan was there, elevated to Eleanor's right at the head table, his toast to preserving legacies a coded pledge. When he approached during the auction, bidding on a hawthorn barrel for his firm's lounge, his grip on Genesis's elbow was proprietary. Your mother's vision aligns with progress, he said, eyes sliding to Clara across the room, chatting with Silas about barrel tannins. But some elements disrupt the brand. Genesis pulled away, the room spinning with champagne flutes and forced laughter, her pulse a drumbeat of rage. She found Clara on the veranda, the night air cool against flushed skin, fireflies winking like conspirators. "This place is a museum of what-ifs," Clara said, leaning on the rail, her voice threaded with weariness. Genesis wrapped arms around her from behind, chin on shoulder, the rivers murmur a distant lullaby. "Then let's rewrite the exhibits," she whispered, kissing the curve of Clara's neck. They slipped away to the orchard, dew-kissed grass yielding under them, the stars witnesses to a vow unspoken. This love, forbidden or not, was theirs to tend. Eleanor's retaliation was swift, a letter delivered by courier the next dawn, formal, typed on hawthorn letterhead, demanding Genesis's resignation from operations. For the stability of the enterprise, it read, citing personal distractions that risked investor confidence. Enclosed was a clause from her father's will, one Genesis had overlooked in grief, a provision allowing Eleanor veto power over immoral conduct, threatening the family name. The ambiguity was deliberate, a noose tailored to fit. Genesis stormed the big house, the letter crumpling in her fist, finding Eleanor in the sunroom amid her herbarium, pruning shears snaking like judgments. "You dismantle everything Dad built for this?" Genesis hurled the paper onto the table, stems scattering like accusations. Eleanor's eyes, pale as winter sky, met hers without flinching. "I built it too after he left us to your whims. A woman like you can't lead without scandal. Harlan offers security. That girl offers chaos." The word girl ignited it, the reduction of Clara to footnote, to threat. "She's more woman than you've ever let yourself be," Genesis shot back, voice breaking on the edge of sob. Eleanor rose, shears forgotten, her face a mask cracking at the seams. "I did this for you to spare you the world's cruelty. But you've chosen it anyway." The room held its breath, the air thick with unsaid histories. Eleanor's own youth, perhaps, bartered for respectability in a town that devoured the deviant. Genesis left without another word, the Ford's tire spitting gravel as she fled to the distillery. There, in the hush of the aging room, barrels stacked like sentinels, she called Clara. "She's trying to bury me," she said, sliding down against the cool stone wall. Clara's voice came fierce through static. "Then we dig you out. Come here tonight. We'll plan our stand." But doubt wormed in. Could she drag Clara into this mire, taint her freedom with Monroe's mud? The decision crystallized over sleepless miles, the dashboard clock ticking toward midnight. Athens welcomed her with sodium lamps and the river's low song, Clara waiting on the stoop with coffee steaming in mugs. They talked until dawn, maps of options spread on the kitchen table. Legal challenges to the wills clause, crowdfunding for a buyout, even selling her share to start anew elsewhere. Clara's hand over hers was steady. "Whatever path, I'm on it. But don't let her define your womanhood. That's ours to claim." Emboldened, Genesis returned to Monroe with fire rekindled, rallying the workers in the break room. Stories of her father's trust in them, vows to fight the sale. Silas pledged his pension. Young Mia, the bottler, her graphic skills for a counter-campaign. Whispers spread, loyalty fracturing Eleanor's facade. Yet the gala's investors circled, Harlan's firm lodging a preliminary offer that undervalued the land by half. His emails to Genesis laced with paternal concern. "Think of your future stability." Clara's next visit brought reinforcements. A leather-bound ledger of her own designs, reimagined as Hawthorne merchandise, projections showing doubled revenue. They presented it to the board, Clara's voice clear as she outlined sustainable sourcing from local farms, her presence a quiet revolution. Eleanor's face paled, but she countered with a private meeting, summoning Genesis to the study lined with her father's ledgers. There, over brandy and crystal snifters, Eleanor softened or seemed to tears glistening as she spoke of losses. Her own mother, who'd shunned her for a youthful indiscretion, the weight of widowhood in a town that pitted the childless. "I only wanted to protect you from that fracture," she said, hand trembling on the decanter. Genesis searched for truth in the vulnerability, a bridge across the chasm. "Protection shouldn't mean erasure, Mother." For a heartbeat, understanding flickered, two women, scarred by the same unyielding expectations. But the moment shattered with Harlan's arrival, uninvited, his knock echoing like intrusion. He bore documents. A proxy vote rigged in Eleanor's favor, the clause weaponized to strip Genesis's shares if she persisted in associations detrimental to the enterprise. Clara's name wasn't spoken, but it poisoned the air. Eleanor signed without hesitation. Her pens scratch a betrayal raw as fresh cuts. The betrayal landed like a gut punch, Genesis fleeing the study with the documents clutched like evidence of matricide. Harlan's voice trailed her. "It's for the best, Jen." But she didn't look back, the big house's grandeur mocking her as she gunned the Ford toward the river road. Dawn broke hazy over the bluffs, mockingbirds trilling as if the world hadn't just tilted. She pulled over at the old fishing spot, tires crunching oyster shells, and hurled her phone into the current. Harlan's texts, offers of compromise, veiled threats sinking with it. Clara found her there hours later, alerted by Mia's frantic call. She arrived without words, sliding onto the tailgate beside Genesis, their shoulders touching in silent communion. The Chattahoochee flowed indifferent below, carrying silt from upstream floods, a reminder that some currents carved canyons over time. "We fight," Clara said finally, her voice gravel steady. "Or we walk. But we choose together." Genesis leaned into her, the choice crystallizing in the warmth of that contact. Not surrender but strategy. They holed up in Clara's Athens workshop for 3 days, the space transformed into war room. Legal pads scrawled with timelines, Clara's leather scraps cut into protest banners reading "Hawthorne blood runs true." Genesis pored over her father's will with a borrowed laptop, uncovering footnotes buried in legalese. A contingency for ethical stewardship, vague enough to argue. She called in favors. An old college roommate, now a Savannah attorney named Juliet, who drove up with case law on discriminatory clauses, her briefcase stuffed with precedents from queer rights battles in the South. Back in Monroe, the town fractured along fault lines long hidden. Workers picketed the gate with signs Clara had tooled, simple, poignant. "Spirits of the soil, not suits." Local papers ran features on the Hawthorne heiress uprising. Photographers capturing Genesis amid the stills, her face resolute in the steam's haze. Eleanor retreated to the big house, but her proxies, Harlan's firm, escalated, freezing distillery accounts under pretext of pending audits. Barrels sat undelivered, invoices piled like accusations, the business teetering on the brink. The climax brewed at the annual county fair, a Hawthorne cornerstone where the community gathered under harvest moons for rides and ribeyes. Eleanor had commandeered the booth, her banners proclaiming a new era for Hawthorne, flanked by Harlan's glossy brochures. Genesis arrived with Clara and a caravan of supporters, Silas with his pipe, Mia with demo bottles, Juliet scanning the crowd for leverage. The air buzzed with cotton candy and diesel, families milling amid Ferris wheel lights, but tension crackled like static. Eleanor spotted them first, her booth a fortress of linen tablecloths and crystal decanters. "This is trespass," she said as Genesis approached, voice pitched for the gathering onlookers. Harlan hovered, arm possessive around her waist, but Genesis ignored him, setting her own makeshift table. Rustic crates holding Clara's wrapped bottles, flyers detailing the fight. "No, Mother. This is homecoming." The confrontation unfolded in fragments. Eleanor's pleas masked as commands, "Think of the legacy," met by Genesis's unyielding recount. The willow night, the therapy cages, the clause's cruelty. Whispers rippled through the crowd, locals who'd nursed on Hawthorne whiskey now murmuring dissent. A woman in the front row, face weathered as the riverbanks, stepped forward. "Your daddy would have hated this division, Miss Eleanor. Jen's got his heart." Harlan blustered, waving the proxy papers, but Juliet countered with a public reading of the will's ethics clause, her voice slicing through the din like a well-aged blade. Clara stood sentinel at Genesis's side, her presence a quiet thunder, hand slipping into Genesis's when Eleanor's gaze turned venomous. "That one's poison," she hissed to Harlan, loud enough for the circle to hear. "Rooted in fear, not family." The words ignited. A chant rose from the workers. "Blood runs true." Swelling as fairgoers joined, phones raised to capture the unraveling. Eleanor cracked then, not with fury but a collapse, sinking onto a folding chair, face ashen under the string lights. I thought I was saving us, she whispered, audible only to Genesis in the hush that followed. Harlan moved to console, but she waved him off, eyes locked on her daughter. You were always the fire, General. I tried to douse it, fearing it'd consume you. But it was me all along burning bridges. The admission hung a bridge of sorts, frail but extending. Genesis knelt before her, the crowd fading to a blur, and took her mother's hands, cold and trembling. Fire doesn't destroy if you let it light the way. No embrace followed, not yet, but the proxy papers slipped from Harlan's grip, trampled under shifting feet as the chant morphed to applause. Investors melted into the night, their offers evaporating like morning mist. In the aftermath, the distillery breathed again, accounts unfrozen by a judge's swift injunction, Juliet's filings exposing the clause as unenforceable under modern equity laws. Sales surged on the reclaimed Roots line, Clara's designs becoming the brand's signature, her workshop expanding with Hawthorne funding. Monroe shifted subtly, rainbow flags fluttering beside Confederate ghosts on porches, sermons softening on love's many measures. Yet the victory tasted bittersweet, laced with the scars of fracture. Eleanor withdrew to the big house's sunroom, pruning her herbs in solitude, letters arriving sporadically, halting apologies scrawled in her elegant hand, hints of her own buried stories. Genesis visited weekly, their talks tentative bridges. Over tea, Eleanor admitted a college dalliance with a roommate, severed by her mother's ultimatum. The pattern of suppression passed like a flawed recipe. Clara and Genesis built slowly, their life a tapestry of compromises. Athens weekends yielding to Monroe Roots, a cottage on distillery land where leather tools mingled with copper mugs. Lovemaking evolved from urgency to reverence, bodies learning the languages of endurance. One evening, as fireflies danced outside their window, Clara traced the faint lines on Genesis's palm, the one she'd etched that furious spring. These are our map now, she said, kissing each ridge. Genesis pulled her close, the fire steady, illuminating paths forward. Summer's humidity cloaked Monroe in a veil of secrets, the air thick as the unspoken truces forming in Hawthorne's shadow. Genesis helmed the distillery with a quiet authority, her mornings spent in the fields with Silas, assessing corn yields under skies bruised with thunderheads. The workers moved with renewed purpose, their loyalty a current stronger than any corporate tide. Stories circulating of Eleanor's concession, the board's unanimous vote affirming Genesis as CEO. Harlan's firm slunk back to Atlanta, their offer withdrawn amid bad press, his parting email a curt best of luck that tasted of ash. Clara's integration wove deeper threads. She opened a satellite workshop on the grounds, a converted shed with skylights framing the stills, where apprentices from town learned to tool belts from repurposed barrel leather. It's about handing down the craft, she'd say, her classes drawing a mix. Farm wives, queer kids from the edges of county lines, even a few church ladies testing waters they'd long avoided. Genesis watched from the doorway one afternoon, all in hand, a young trans man named Riley etching his first river pattern, his concentration fierce as prayer. Clara caught her eye winking over the workbench, a shared language of reclamation. Their evenings unfolded in rhythms of intimacy. Suppers on the cottage porch, fireflies mirroring the glow of lantern light, plates of cornbread and greens from the greenhouse Eleanor now tended sporadically. Conversations meandered from business ledgers to childhood haunts, Clara's tales of clamming on Tybee Island, Genesis's memories of her father's whistle tunes in the barn. Lovemaking came in waves, sometimes fierce against the kitchen table after a long day, other times slow under quilts stitched by Clara's grandmother, bodies whispering affirmations against the dark. Yet fractures lingered, hairline but persistent. Eleanor's letters grew bolder, inviting Genesis to tea without the weight of agenda, but Clara's name evoked a flinch, a shadow of the girl label. One such afternoon in the sunroom's herb-scented hush, Eleanor broached it haltingly. I've been reading about choices like yours. The church group, they're starting dialogues. Her hands twisted a sprig of rosemary, releasing its piney bite. Genesis sipped her tea, the steam veiling her skepticism. Dialogues or interrogations? Eleanor met her gaze, unflinching for once. Learning, perhaps. For the first time. The olive branch tempted, but trust rebuilt like a still, slow boil, careful monitoring. Genesis shared it with Clara that night, over bourbon neat on their swing. "She's trying," she said, swirling the amber liquid. Clara nodded, her head on Genesis's shoulder, but her voice held caution. "Trying's a start, but forgiveness isn't forgetting. Guard your fire." They made love under the stars then, urgent and affirming, the swing creaking like a heartbeat. Fall brought harvest frenzy, the distillery alive with the grind of mash and the yeasty tang of fermentation. The Reclaimed Roots launch party drew regional press, tents erected along the riverbank where fiddles once again wailed under harvest moons. Clara's cuffs adorned every bottle, her designs etched with motifs of bent willows, subtle nods to Genesis's past, reclaimed as strength. Eleanor arrived fashionably late, her dress simple linen, no harlan on arm. She mingled awkwardly at first, nodding to workers who'd once averted eyes, but when she approached the tasting table, it was with a flask of her own, a private blend, aged in her greenhouse barrels, notes of fig and regret. "To new vintages," she toasted Genesis quietly, clinking glasses amid the crowd's roar. No embrace, but the gesture lingered, a crack in the fortress. Clara observed from afar, her smile guarded but genuine when Eleanor extended a hand. "Your work honors the land." "Thank you." The words hung, simple yet seismic, acknowledgement not absolution. As leaves turned crimson, deeper currents stirred. Juliet visited for a strategy session, her briefcase now filled with expansion plans. Distilleries in Oregon's Willamette Valley, a nod to Genesis's dreams of broader horizons. But over dinner at the cottage, wine flowing, Juliet probed the personal. "You two are solid, but Monroe's a small pond. Ever think of swimming upstream?" Clara laughed it off, but Genesis felt the pull. The river's call beyond bluffs, freedom untethered from legacy's anchor. The question festered through November's chill, manifesting in quiet drifts. Genesis lingering longer at the stills, Clara's truck making solo runs to Athens suppliers. One evening, after a spat over delayed shipments, words sharpened by exhaustion, Clara packed a bag. "I need space to breathe," she said, eyes stormy. "Not from you, but this place, it's got hooks." Genesis nodded, throat tight, watching taillights fade once more, the echo of Lena's departure a ghost at her shoulder. Alone, the cottage echoed with absence, the workbench idle, bottles uncuffed. Genesis turned to the river, walking its banks in the moon's silver, questions churning like rapids. Was love enough to bridge divides of class, of roots, of the South's stubborn soil? She called Eleanor unbidden, the line ringing into midnight. "I think I'm losing her," she confessed, voice raw. Her mother's pause stretched, then softened. "Then fight like you did for this place. Not with walls, but with open hands." Dawn brought resolve. Genesis drove to Athens, finding Clara at the riverfront market, her stall vibrant with holiday wares. No grand gestures, just presence, handing over a small package. A leather journal tooled by her own hands, pages filled with sketches of their shared dreams. Cabins in Vermont pines, vineyards in Texas hills. "I etched our map," Genesis said, voice steady. "But the paths are yours to choose." Clara traced the lines, tears tracing her own, and pulled her into the stall's shadow. Their kiss salt and renewal. Winter solstice marked turning. A small ceremony at the distillery, workers and kin gathered around a bonfire, Eleanor's fig-infused cordial passed hand to hand. She spoke briefly, voice carrying over the crackle. "Legacy isn't blood or boardrooms, it's the stories we allow to breathe." Applause rippled, Clara's hand warm in Genesis's, the fire's glow forgiving shadows. The new year dawned crisp, Monroe's fields dusted with frost that sparkled like tentative peace. Genesis and Clara navigated the thaw with deliberate steps, their cottage a sanctuary of small rituals. Mornings blending Clara's mead with hawthorn rye, evenings sketching blueprints for that Oregon venture. Juliet's plans evolving into a joint operation, leather-infused spirits for West Coast palates. Whispers in town shifted from scandal to legend. The Hawthorne Reckoning, a tale told over fences, inspiring a local queer alliance that met in the old barrel house, its walls echoing with voices long silenced. Eleanor's evolution unfolded in layers, like an onion revealing soil-rich heart. She joined the alliance's first reading circle, books on Southern queer histories stacked on her sunroom shelves, her annotations fierce in margins. Visits to the cottage became weekly, bearing pies from recipes her mother had hoarded, conversations veering into uncharted waters. Eleanor's admission of a letter from her own mother, postmarked decades late, apologizing for the shunning that had forged her armor. "I became the blade to avoid the cut," she confessed one gray afternoon, rain pattering the panes. Genesis listened, the weight lifting incrementally, forgiveness a slow distillation. Clara warmed gradually, her guarded smiles blooming into shared teas, discussions over leather stains and barrel characters. "She's got grit under the polish," Clara allowed one night, as they lay tangled in sheets, the cottage lantern casting golden pools. Genesis traced Clara's collarbone, the skin there soft as untanned hide. "Grit we all share, scarred the same." Their lovemaking deepened, exploratory, fingers mapping new territories of trust, breath sinking like tides. Yet echoes persisted, tests of the fragile weave. Harlan resurfaced in spring, not as suitor but shadow, offering consulting through a proxy firm, his emails polished with mutual benefit. Genesis forwarded them to Juliet, who dismantled the overtures in court filings, exposing conflicts of interest tied to Eleanor's old allies. The skirmish drew media, a Atlanta Journal piece framing Genesis as Southern Sapphic savior. Clara's photo beside hers, hands linked over a bottle, defiance in their gaze. Backlash followed. Anonymous letters to the distillery, Bible verses scorched on crate lids, church pews thinning for Hawthorne events. The ugliest came at a regional expo in Savannah, where competitors whispered of moral hazards to buyers, Harlan's influence lingering like bad mash. Genesis overheard in the hospitality suite, a cluster of distributors chuckling over ports. "Hawthorne's gone fruity literally." Rage boiled, but Clara pulled her aside to the balcony, the city's spires hazy in dusk. "Let them choke on their own rot," she said, pressing a tooled keychain into Genesis's palm. A tiny still etched with flames. "We're the vintage that ages best." They returned to Monroe fortified, channeling the sting into innovation. A defiant blend. Proceeds funding the Alliance's youth scholarships. Sales soared, irony sweet as the bourbon's finish. Eleanor's response surprised. A donation from her private trust, anonymous but unmistakable, her note reading. "For the fires I once feared." Summer swelled with growth. The Oregon site breaking ground, a hillside vineyard in Willamette's folds, Clara's workshop annex planned amid the firs. They scouted it together, driving coastal roads with windows down, salt wind tangling hair. "This is freedom's edge," Clara said, standing on a bluff overlooking crashing waves, her voice awed. Genesis wrapped arms around her waist, chin on shoulder, the Pacific's roar drowning doubts. "Our edge now." Back home, tensions crested in a family rite twisted. Eleanor's birthday gala, rechristened a legacy luau to honor her coastal roots. Invitations extended to the Alliance, tables mixed with old guard, fiddles yielding to steel guitars. Eleanor, in a flowing muumuu, danced tentatively with Silas, her laughter rare and real. Genesis and Clara twirled nearby, the floor yielding under boots, but midway a drunk uncle, Eleanor's brother long estranged, slurred slurs from the bar, glass raised like accusation. "This ain't no rainbow parade, Ellie. You've let the devil in." The room stilled, echoes of old verdicts. Eleanor turned, face draining, but instead of retreat, she crossed to him, voice steel-wrapped silk. "The devil's in division, brother. And I've danced with him long enough." She took the glass from his hand, pouring it out, then pulled Genesis into a waltz, awkward, unpracticed but unbroken. Clara joined, Silas too, the circle expanding until the uncle slunk away, the night reclaiming joy. In the quiet after, on the veranda slick with dew, Eleanor pulled Genesis aside. "I was wrong from the willow to now. Your womanhood isn't mine to measure." Tears traced her cheeks, silver in moonlight. Genesis embraced her then, fully, the hug a dam breaking. Sobs mingling, years dissolving in salt. Clara watched from the rail, her nod a benediction. Autumn's harvest felt hallowed. The distillery's yield bountiful under cooperative hands. As leaves fell gold, Genesis proposed, not with rings but a shared ledger. Co-ownership papers for the Oregon site, tooled covers from Clara's hand. "Partners in every measure," she said, under the willow tree, its branches a canopy of grace. Clara's yes was a kiss, deep and declarative, the river murmuring approval. Winter whispered of expansions. Vermont retreats for alliance writers, Texas collaborations with queer ranchers. Eleanor's sunroom became a lending library, books circulating like cordials. Monroe, scarred but softening, hosted its first Pride Walk, banners of bent willows fluttering, hawthorn bottles toasting the march. By spring's tender bloom, the Hawthorne empire spanned horizons, Monroe's heart still beating in Georgia clay, but tendrils reaching to Oregon's mists and Vermont's maples. Genesis divided her weeks between sites, the Ford upgraded to a hybrid truck hauling samples and sketches, Clara her constant co-pilot. Their Oregon cabin nestled in Vineyard Rose, walls paneled in reclaimed barrel staves, Clara's workbench overlooking Deer Pass. Mornings there were sacrament. Coffee brewed strong, love-making lazy and sun-dappled sheets, bodies attuned to the land's quiet pulse. Monroe evolved under the stewardship, the distillery a hub for community, workshops blending craft and craft liquor, queer elders sharing oral histories over tastings. Eleanor's role shifted to ambassador, her teas now forms for dialogue, her greenhouse yielding herbs for experimental infusions, lavender from Alliance Gardens, mint from Reformed church plots. Her letters to Genesis, once stilted, flowed with warmth, enclosures of pressed wildflowers, notes on dreams revisited. I see your father in your resolve, one read. But your light is all your own. Clara's scars softened too, her Athens roots honored in a satellite gallery, pieces shipped to Monroe exhibits. Yet vulnerabilities surfaced in waves. A nightmare of eviction, pulling her bolt upright, Genesis soothing with whispers and touch. We're rooted now, Genesis murmured, fingers threading hair. Twined, not trapped. Clara's response was a vow, etched in morning light. Then let's grow wild. Challenges arose as rivers carve. A drought-pinching Georgia yields forcing ration blends. A Vermont zoning battle over moral zoning, echoing old clauses. Juliet led the charges, her firm expanding with Hawthorne retainers, but each victory cost. Night's Genesis paced the cottage, ledgers blurring with worry. Clara grounded her, hands on shoulders. Storms pass, we distill the strength. The deepest trial brewed in summer's heat, a callback to fractures. Harlan's proxy resurfaced through a shell company, bidding on Oregon land adjacent to theirs, speculative condos threatening the vineyard's quiet. Whispers linked it to Eleanor's old circle, but investigation revealed her clean. She divested fully, her shares gifted to Genesis in a quiet notarization. The revelation came over a clandestine dinner at the big house, Eleanor's table set for 3 roast quail, her fig cordial. I wanted no strings, she said, eyes clear. Just amends. The confrontation unfolded at a Portland trade show, Harlan cornered in a hospitality lounge amid craft gin sommeliers. Genesis faced him flanked by Clara and Juliet, voice even. This isn't chess, Harlan. It's legacy, ours, not your ledgers. He blustered, suit creased from travel, but Clara's quiet interjection landed truest. You've built walls, we've built bridges. Yours crumble. Investors, sensing the tide, withdrew funding. The bid collapsed like overproof mash. Triumph tasted of reconciliation. Eleanor visiting the Oregon site, her first flight in decades, marveling at the firs. They walked the rows together, Genesis's arm linked with hers, Clara trailing with a basket of leather-wrapped bottles. It's vast, Eleanor breathed, wind-tousling silver hair. Like the heart you hid. No tears but a shared silence profound as prayer. Fall deepened bonds. A harvest festival spanning sites. Fiddles in Georgia syncing with bluegrass in Vermont via live stream. Monroe's walk swelled. Eleanor's float a float of herb wreaths. Her wave to the crowd genuine. Genesis and Clara led. Hands linked, the willow motif banners fluttering. Symbols of Ben's endured, strengths forged. Winter's hush brought introspection. Clara proposing a sabbatical, a road trip tracing queer landmarks. Stonewall echoes in New York, Black history trails in Texas. Genesis agreed, the cottage shuddered for snow. Their journey a tapestry of motels and memories. In a New Orleans jazz club, saxophone wailing, Clara danced her into forgiveness's full embrace. You've made me whole. Genesis's reply was a lifetime's unburdening. And you my true north. Returning to Monroe, they found Eleanor hosting a solstice vigil. Candles along the river, stories shared in circle. Her tale came halting. The college love severed but sacred, a fire she'd mourned in silence. I see now, suppression starves the soul. Applause was soft, communal, the group weaving tighter. The company's zenith crested in a national award. Sustainable Spirit of the Year. Lauded for ethics and innovation. Acceptance in DC. Genesis spoke to a sea of faces. Womanhood isn't granted. It's claimed in stills and scars, in loves that defy the divide. Clara beside her, Eleanor's nod from the wings. A trinity mended. Yet the human pulse persists. Eleanor's health faltering with autumn's turn. A cough lingering into chills. Doctors murmuring of legacies deeper than ledgers. Genesis tends her now, broth simmered in the sunroom. Clara's tooled pillows propping frail form. You've given me time, Eleanor whispers, hand in daughter's. To be real. In the distillery's hush, Genesis reflects. The fire once feared, now hearth warming without consuming. Clara's touch anchors her, their future a blend untasted. Children perhaps, adopted from the alliance's folds. Expansions to uncharted coasts. Monroe once cage, now cradle. Its people kin, not critics. The willow stands sentinel. Branches swaying in breeze, whispering of beginnings reclaimed. Genesis owns more than company. She owns her story. Etched, enduring, eternally hers. Eleanor's decline unfolded like a slow barrel roll. The cough evolving into rasps that echoed through the big house's halls. Her once steady hands trembling over teacups. Doctors in Atlanta confirmed the shadow on her lungs. Time measured in seasons, not years, treatments a gamble on borrowed grace. Genesis shuttled between sites, the hybrid truck laden with experimental elixirs from Vermont herbalists, but it was Clara who insisted on permanence. We're her bridge now. Let's cross it steady. They moved into the big house, transforming the guest wing into a haven. Clara's leather throws softening brocade sofas. Genesis's small batch cordials lining the sideboard for palliative sips. Nights blurred into vigils. Eleanor's stories spilling freer in fever's haze. Fragments of a youth bartered for propriety. A debutante's poise masking midnight drives to hidden speakeasies. Kisses stolen with a Charleston flapper whose letters burned in regretful fires. She called me her magnolia, Eleanor murmured one dawn, eyes distant on the orchard. I called myself coward. Genesis held her hand. The skin paper thin, veins mapping battles lost. You bloomed anyway, she said, voice thick. Clara, from the doorway with fresh linens, added softly. And rooted deep enough for us. No sermons, just presence. A trinity tending the flame. Monroe rallied around the matriarch, its evolution mirroring her fade. Church ladies delivering casseroles without judgment, the alliance organizing riverfront fundraisers, proceeds for hospice expansions. Silas carved a cane from orchard oak, tooled by Clara with willow motifs, Eleanor's grip steadying on its curve. The distillery hummed on autopilot, Mia stepping up as operations lead, her graphics now branding Eleanor's reserve. A gentle blend of fig and forgiveness, sales funding care. Clara and Genesis carved space amid the vigil. Stolen walks to the river, where willows dipped conspiratorial, their talks weaving future threads. Kids! Clara ventured one twilight, skipping pebbles into the current. Genesis smiled, imagining tiny hands on awls and stills. Ours chosen, fierce. The dream solidified over campfires, plans for adoption from southern foster folds. A family forged not blood but bond. Eleanor's lucid days brought profundity. A will revision, shares reaffirmed to Genesis with codicils for Clara, partners in perpetuity, and bequests to the alliance. No more strings, she rasped, notary's pen scratching finality. Harlan's ghost lingered in one clause. A letter to be sent post-mortem, forgiving his ambitions, urging his own reckoning. Mercy for the misguided, she explained, a faint smile ghosting lips. As leaves turned, Eleanor's strength waned, the greenhouse untended, herbs wilting like unsaid words. The end came gently under a harvest moon filtering through lace curtains. Family gathered, fiddles silent on the veranda. She slipped away mid-story, voice trailing on a memory of her mother's rare hug. The room holding breath until release. Genesis closed her eyes, the fire passing not as blaze, but ember warm, enduring. The funeral was Monroe's requiem. Procession to the family plot under willows, eulogies blending old guard and new, Reverend speaking of redemption's quiet distill, Silas toasting with her reserve. Clara's tribute, a tooled journal of Eleanor's tales passed hand to hand. A legacy etched, not entombed. Genesis spoke last, voice steady over the casket. You taught me womanhood's weight and its wings. Fly free, mother. Grief's tide pulled deep, but Clara anchored, their love a levee against flood. They scattered ashes along the Chattahoochee at dawn, the river claiming her in silt and song, a final current. Back at the cottage amid unpacked boxes from the big house, Eleanor's pearls rest-rung as Clara's necklace. They made love fierce and healing, bodies affirming life's pulse. Spring's renewal mirrored rebirth, the distillery launching embers light. A smoky single malt honoring transition, its label a willow in flame. Oregon's vines thrived, Vermont's retreats hosting Eleanor's namesake fellowships, writers penning suppressed Southern Sapphics. Adoption papers processed, a sibling pair from Georgia Hills joining soon. Toddler Theo with Clara's storm eyes, 8-year-old Lena echoing the lost first love's name. A cycle closed gently. Monroe's Pride Walk swelled to festival, rainbows draping the distillery gates, Eleanor's float reborn as a heritage wagon, herbs trailing in her wake. Genesis and Clara led with the children in tow, tiny hands waving banners, the crowds roar a chorus of acceptance. Years folded forward. The empire a constellation, Monroe core satellites pulsing with kin. Genesis gray threading temples mentored Mia's expansions. Clara's workshop spanned coasts, her apprentices carrying bent willows worldwide. The kids grew wild-hearted. Theo tooling belts at 10, Lena blending her first cordial at 12, family suppers raucous with laughter. One August eve under the willow, now gnarled guardian, Genesis traced the trunk's scars, Clara beside, hands linked over a picnic of reserves. She was wrong, Clara murmured, head on shoulder. Genesis smiled, fire eternal. And right, we're real as the river. The company thrives, not in boardrooms but hearts, a testament. Womanhood claimed, love liberated, legacies reclaimed. In Monroe's hush the spirits whisper on, bend but never break.